Imagine standing on a road somewhere in what used to be Germany, sometime in the summer of 1945. The gunfire has stopped. The bombers have finally gone quiet. Across the countryside, the wreckage of the most destructive war in human history lies scattered in every direction. Burned out tanks half sunk into mud, broken artillery pieces rusting in fields, entire towns reduced to mountains of brick and ash. But somewhere in that broken landscape, you hear a sound that has nothing to do with machines. It is the slow, heavy clop of hooves on broken pavement. A horse, then another, then a dozen more, some of them limping, some of them hollow-cheeked and trembling, pulling wagons that no longer have anywhere particular to go. Some are standing alone in fields, still harnessed to equipment, abandoned by soldiers who simply walked away and never came back. This is the part of the story that history almost never tells. When the war ended in May 1945, there were roughly 400,000 horses still alive on German soil, animals that had spent years hauling artillery shells through Russian snowstorms, dragging supply wagons across the blood-soaked fields of the Eastern Front, and carrying messengers through forests that burned. They had done everything asked of them, without complaint, without understanding, without choice. And now that the guns had finally fallen silent, the world had absolutely no idea what to do with them. This is their story. The myth of the mechanized Wehrmacht. Before we can talk about what happened to these horses after the war, we need to understand something that will probably surprise you, because it surprised virtually everyone who encountered it at the time. The popular image of the German military machine is one of sleek, roaring efficiency. Panzer tanks rolling in tight formation, Stuka dive bombers screaming out of clear skies, columns of half-track vehicles spitting exhaust across open plains. That image was not an accident. It was carefully constructed by Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda apparatus, which controlled every frame of newsreel footage shown to the German public and the world. Cameras followed the tanks. They did not follow what came behind them. What came behind them was horses, an enormous, almost incomprehensible number of horses. The German army entered the Second World War in 1939 with 514,000 horses already in military service. Over the full course of the conflict, the Wehrmacht would put approximately 2.75 million horses and mules into uniform, which works out to nearly double the number Germany used during the entirety of the First World War. At any given moment between 1939 and 1945, there were on average around 1.1 million horses actively serving in the German military. Let that number settle for a moment. 1,100,000 horses, simultaneously, at any given time. The German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser, who spent years studying the Wehrmacht's operational record, came to a conclusion that cuts against everything popular culture tells us about Nazi Germany's military power. He wrote that the image of the German blitzkrieg army was, in his words, a figment of propaganda imagination. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht had approximately 120,000 motorized vehicles. France, at the same moment, had 400,000. Britain had even more. The famous fast-moving panzer divisions that punch through Allied lines represented, in the final accounting, only about 1/5 of the total German army. Everything else, the artillery, the ammunition, the food, the medical supplies, the communication cables, the engineering equipment, moved on 4 legs and a pair of hooves. One of the most telling details to come out of the immediate post-war period involves a group of German soldiers captured after the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. These men were being held as prisoners of war and were waiting to be transported to camps in England or America. As the trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles of the Allied supply chain rolled endlessly past them off the landing ships, the German soldiers reportedly stared in open disbelief. According to accounts recorded by their guards, some of them asked more than once, "But where are the horses?" They were asking genuinely, because in their experience an army moved on horses. The idea that an army this large could function almost entirely on internal combustion engines was genuinely foreign to them, because it was foreign to the world they had fought in. Why did Germany rely so heavily on animals in the age of motorization? The answer comes down to a resource that shaped nearly every major decision the Third Reich ever made: oil. Germany had almost no domestic petroleum production. Its access to fuel was always precarious, always dependent on synthetic production from coal, and on whatever the Axis could seize or purchase from Romania and other sources. Horses, on the other hand, ran on oats, and oats, unlike gasoline, could be requisitioned from the farms of Poland, Ukraine, and every other territory the Wehrmacht conquered. A typical German infantry division in 1943 had 256 trucks and 2,652 horses, attended by over 4,000 men, whose sole job was the care and management of those animals. Some divisional configurations used as many as 6,300 horses. The supply train of a comparable Soviet infantry division, by contrast, had 91 trucks and only 556 horses, because the Soviets had domestic oil and benefited from the massive American truck supply program flowing through the Lend-Lease arrangement. Germany was, in the stark language of one military historian, conducting a war that looked from the air like it belonged to 1939, but on the ground moved at the pace of 1916. What it cost the horses. Understanding the scale of horse use in the Wehrmacht is one thing. Understanding what the war actually cost those animals is another thing entirely, and it demands a willingness to sit with some genuinely hard details. On the Eastern Front in particular, the conditions imposed on horses were catastrophic. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, sending more than 3 million soldiers and hundreds of thousands of horses east across a front stretching nearly 1,000 miles. In the early weeks, the advance was extraordinary. German units swept hundreds of miles into Soviet territory at a pace that stunned even their own commanders. But this speed masked a brutal truth. The horses were dying. One German soldier wrote home from the front, and his words are preserved in the historical record. "Our poor horses are being pushed to the very limits and are suffering horribly. We can no longer offer them straw to lie on or hay to eat. They get ice water to drink and have to nibble on small branches we gather from the forest. At night they have little shelter from the freezing cold, often having to lie with their bellies in the icy snow." General Heinz Guderian, the Panzer commander who is sometimes celebrated as the architect of modern armored warfare, noted in his own memoirs that the first snow of the Russian winter fell during the night of October 6th to 7th, 1941, and that the roads rapidly became nothing but canals of bottomless mud, along which our vehicles could only advance at snail's pace. The horse-drawn units fared no better. Autumn rains turned the unpaved roads of the Soviet Union into a substance called rasputitsa, a Russian word that essentially means mud season, and entire columns of horse-drawn wagons sank axle-deep into it, the horses straining until their hearts gave out. And then winter came. The winter of 1941 to 1942 on the Eastern Front was among the worst in a generation. Temperatures dropped to -30, -40 degrees Celsius in some areas. For the horses, which had been requisitioned from farms across Central Europe and were not acclimated to Russian cold, it was a death sentence on an industrial scale. In just 2 months, December 1941 and January 1942, the Wehrmacht lost 179,000 horses on the Eastern Front. That is nearly 3,000 animals dying every single day for 2 consecutive months. One German gunner recorded the scene along a road of retreat. "Our route is lined by dead horses that have broken their legs or collapsed through sheer exhaustion." A German general described the battlefield as a fantastic sight, full of dead horses. Some horses were only half dead, standing on 3 frozen legs, shaking the remaining broken one. Horses died on the battlefields of the Eastern Front at the estimated rate of 1,000 per day throughout much of the conflict. They died from wounds caused by artillery shells, fires, bullets, and hand grenades. They died from starvation when supply lines collapsed and fodder ran out. They died from diseases that spread rapidly through units massed together in inadequate conditions. They died from pure, grinding exhaustion, their bodies simply shutting down after too many miles under too much weight in too much cold. A working horse under heavy load required up to 12 pounds of grain every single day to maintain condition. In a logistical environment where the German army was perpetually struggling to feed its own soldiers, getting that amount of grain to the animals that pulled the guns and wagons was essentially impossible. Horses left to graze on grass alone lost fitness so rapidly they became useless within weeks. The account soldiers left behind capture the degradation with a visceral precision that no statistics can fully convey. One soldier wrote of what happened when a horse finally died on the march. Can you imagine people flinging themselves at an old horse corpse, tearing open the head and swallowing its brain raw? Another described the men of his unit cooking horse that had been lying frozen in the snow for a month. You will have to imagine how it tastes, without salt or any other seasoning, and when the animal gave up the ghost a month ago and has been lying under the snow ever since. The horses were not just dying in the cold. They were becoming the food that kept the men from dying in the cold. Despite this relentless attrition, Germany somehow maintained a steady enough supply of horses to keep its infantry divisions functional until the very end of the war. Horses were purchased from Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Ireland. They were requisitioned from farmers in occupied Poland, sometimes as many as 4,000 animals a week from Poland alone. They were taken from France after the 1940 armistice. A number of Berber horses captured in North Africa found their way into Wehrmacht service. The German military was, in effect, vacuuming up every suitable animal from a continent, feeding them into a machine that consumed them faster than they could be replaced. By the spring of 1945, that machine was breaking apart. The collapse in the East, the winter of 1944 into 1945 was, for the German army in the East, the beginning of the end of everything. The Soviet military had been methodically rebuilding its strength since the catastrophe of 1941, and by January 1945, it was ready to deliver the blow that would finish the war. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. 1.5 million soldiers crossed the front lines simultaneously. German General Heinz Guderian had warned Hitler months earlier that the defenses in the East were like a house of cards. If the front is broken through at one point, all the rest will collapse. Hitler had dismissed the entire Red Army as the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. He was wrong. The front did not just collapse, it disintegrated. Entire German divisions that had been holding their positions for months suddenly found themselves cut off, surrounded, or simply swept aside by an offensive, moving at speeds that paralyzed the Wehrmacht's ability to respond. The horses that had spent years hauling supply wagons and artillery pieces now found themselves at the center of one of the largest human and animal migrations in modern European history. Nowhere was this more devastating than in East Prussia, the ancient Prussian province on the Baltic coast, home to some of Germany's most important farmland, horse breeding estates, and a civilian population that had lived there for generations. The Nazis, through their propaganda machinery, had systematically kept East Prussians uninformed about just how dire the military situation had become. When the Soviet offensive struck in January 1945, the civilian population was caught almost entirely off guard. Gauleiter Erich Koch, the Nazi administrator of East Prussia, had repeatedly blocked evacuation requests from military commanders who understood what was coming. The result was that by the time ordinary families were finally permitted to leave in mid-January 1945, in minus 20 degrees temperatures, the Soviet advance was already cutting off the main roads and rail lines. What followed was one of the most desperate mass exoduses in European history. Roughly 2 million civilians began moving west on foot, in carts, in wagons, in anything that could carry them. Women, children, and elderly people. The young men were already in the army, loaded whatever they could onto horse-drawn wagons, and set out through blizzards. The Red Army advanced at 3 times the pace refugees could move. Columns of wagons were strafed from the air by Soviet aircraft. Roads became so clogged with people and animals that movement sometimes slowed to a few kilometers a day. Some families tried to cross the Friesches Haff, a coastal lagoon that froze over in winter, walking across the ice to reach the Baltic coast. And Soviet bombers attacked the ice directly, blowing holes through which wagons and horses and people plunged into the freezing water below. For the horses in particular, the chaos meant abandonment. The horses pulling refugee wagons were pushed beyond the limits of endurance. When they collapsed and could not be revived, the families they served had a terrible choice: leave the animals where they fell and find some other way forward, or lose the protection from the cold that the wagon represented. Most left them. The roads of East Prussia in those weeks of January and February 1945 were lined with dead horses in the snow. Some of the horses were cut from their harnesses by soldiers who needed them for military purposes. Others wandered loose when their owners were killed by Soviet aircraft or were captured by the Red Army. A few were shot by retreating German soldiers who could not bear to leave them alive for the enemy, or who feared the Soviets would use them. Many simply died where they stood, from cold, from exhaustion, from wounds, from the simple absence of anyone left to care for them. The refugee accounts that survived the war return again and again to a specific, heartbreaking moment, the point at which, having finally reached the Baltic coast and a waiting ship, families had to leave their horses behind. The horses could not go on the ships. They had carried their owners for hundreds of miles across frozen roads, through blizzards and bomb attacks, through chaos that would test the endurance of any living creature. And at the water's edge, they were simply cut loose. One account, quoted in a later history of the East Prussian evacuation, describes the moment a family reached the harbor at Pillau. It was more than we could bear to see the German soldiers take the horses out of their harnesses. The animals stood on the dock watching the ships leave. What happened to them after that, nobody recorded. The Trakehner, a breed on the edge of extinction. Among the hundreds of thousands of horses caught in the collapse of East Prussia, there was one specific group whose story deserves particular attention, both for what it reveals about the human relationship with horses and for what it tells us about the sheer scale of loss. The Trakehner is a breed of warm-blood horse that had been developed over more than 2 centuries at the Royal Prussian State Stud in the town of Trakehner, in the heart of East Prussia. Established in 1732 by King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia, the father of Frederick the Great, the stud farm had grown into one of the most celebrated horse breeding operations in the world. The horses were athletic, intelligent, refined, and extraordinarily versatile, excelling as cavalry mounts, farm animals, and in peacetime as Olympic-level sport horses. At the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, the famous games overshadowed by Nazi pageantry, the German equestrian team won 6 gold medals and 1 silver, dominating all 3 disciplines of dressage, jumping, and the 3-day event. Many of those horses were Trakehner's. Before the war, the East Prussian stud book for Trakehner horses numbered 27,000 registered animals. Private breeders across East Prussia maintained herds of mares to be covered by state stallions. These horses were, for many farming families in the province, not just economic assets, but deeply beloved companions. Animals that had been in their families for generations, branded with the distinctive mark of an elk antler on their hip. When the Soviet advance threatened Trakehner in October 1944, Nazi administrators finally gave permission for approximately 800 of the most valuable horses to be evacuated by rail and on foot. But the evacuation did not go far enough west. Most of those animals, along with all their registration documentation, were eventually captured by Soviet forces and shipped east into Russia. The private breeders, the East Prussian farming families who owned Trakehner mares, were not permitted to evacuate until January 1945, when the front had already collapsed. What followed became known simply as Der Trek, the Trek, and it was exactly as brutal as that name suggests. Around 18,000 Trakehner horses were hitched to wagons laden with whatever possessions and feed their owners could carry, and began a westward journey through conditions of almost unimaginable severity. The trek covered approximately 600 miles across frozen roads, rivers, and the ice of the Frischeshafen Lagoon. The mares were heavy in foal. It was late winter, and breeding season had not accounted for war. Many mares lost their foals. Others went lame on the frozen roads and had to be abandoned. Soviet aircraft attacked the columns crossing the half ice. The ice cracked. Horses and people went into the freezing water together. The trek lasted approximately 2.5 months, and when it was over, when the survivors finally reached the relative safety of Western Germany, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, starving, the accounting was devastating. From a pre-war breeding population of 25,000 brood mares and 1,200 approved stallions, fewer than 1,500 Trakehner horses could be found in all of Germany. From the main Trakehner stud itself, only 27 brood mares had survived. One account records that the horses who did arrive in the West limped into Germany, suffering from open wounds from shrapnel and with burlap bags frozen to their feet in place of shoes. Of the original 18,000 horses that set out on the trek, fewer than 700 were ultimately accounted for when the surviving animals were registered in post-war Germany. The most valuable stallions were lost almost entirely. Some were captured by the Soviets and shipped to the Kirov stud in Russia, where they formed the foundation of what became the Russian Trakehner line. Some were known to have been shot. A few colts had been evacuated earlier in the war to the German state stud at Celle, and some of these survived, though even those were then subject to confiscation by British, French, and American occupying forces looking to improve their own cavalry bloodlines. It fell to one man, Dr. Fritz Schilke, the executive director of the East Prussian Stud Book Society, to begin the painstaking work of locating every surviving Trakehner horse scattered across the ruins of Germany. He traveled the length and breadth of the country, tracking down individual animals from rumor and description, checking the elk antler brand on their hips. In 1947, his work formed the foundation of the Trakehner Verband, the West German breeding registry that still exists today. Because so many registration papers had been lost in the chaos of the retreat, some entries in the earliest post-war stud books contain only a simple notation: mare branded with moose antler, papers lost due to events of war. Those horses that did survive became the foundation for one of the most remarkable recovery stories in equestrian history. Modern Trakehners are among the most celebrated sport horse breeds in the world. They compete at the Olympics, Games. Their bloodlines run through dozens of other warm blood breeds across Europe, but the number that carried that entire legacy forward, from a herd of nearly 80,000 that existed in East Prussia before the war, was fewer than 700 animals. Operation Cowboy. When soldiers fought to save horses. While the catastrophe in East Prussia was unfolding, a very different kind of horse story was playing out in a small town, in what is now the Czech Republic, a story so improbable that it sounds like it was invented, yet is documented in extraordinary detail and was even made into a Disney film in 1963. The town was Hostau, in the Sudetenland region, and the horses in question were the Lipizzaner breeding mares of the Spanish riding school in Vienna. The Lipizzaner is one of the oldest cultivated horse breeds in Europe, with a lineage stretching back to 1580 and a continuous connection to the Spanish riding school in Vienna since 1572. These white or gray horses, they are born dark and lighten with age, perform the extraordinary classical dressage movements known as haute école, or high school, including the spectacular airborne maneuvers called the heirs above the ground. The breed is extraordinarily rare. Its bloodlines, traceable to 8 foundation stallions, fold in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Every Lipizzaner alive today traces its ancestry to those 8 animals. In 1938, following the annexation of Austria, the Nazis had moved the Lipizzaner breeding mares to Hostau, where they became part of a bizarre program to develop an Aryan horse through selective breeding. The performing stallions remained in Vienna. By April 1945, both groups were in mortal danger. The Red Army was approaching Hostau from the east. The American Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, was positioned west of the Czech border. The German soldiers caring for the horses at Hostau, including a Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Lieutenant Colonel Walter Holters, who had become stranded there, were in a state of barely controlled panic. They had heard what had happened to Hungary's entire Royal Lipizzaner collection when Soviet forces swept through Budapest. The Soviets had slaughtered the horses for food. To make the fear even more immediate, desperate refugees were attempting to raid the Hostau farm and steal horses for their meat. The horses were literally being eyed as nutrition by starving civilians. Holters made a decision. He reached out to the nearest American unit, the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Cavalry Group, to negotiate a surrender, on the condition that the Americans would save the horses. What made this particular proposal land in sympathetic ears was partly coincidence and partly the specific culture of the American cavalry. Colonel Charles Hancock Reed, the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Group, was a passionate horseman who had exchanged his own beloved horses for armored scout cars when the unit mechanized. When one of his intelligence officers showed him photographs found in a captured German officer's briefcase, photographs of Lipizzaner stallions, Reed instantly recognized the Spanish riding school horses. He understood exactly what was at stake. Reed sent a message to Patton's headquarters. Patton, who had himself competed in the 1912 Olympic pentathlon and was a lifelong horseman, reportedly replied, "Get them! Make it fast. You'll get another assignment." The mission became known as Operation Cowboy. It was carried out on April 28, 1945, less than 2 weeks before Germany's final surrender. A task force of approximately 180 American soldiers, 2 cavalry reconnaissance troops, 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks, and a pair of howitzer motor carriages drove 20 miles behind German lines to reach Hostau. The German garrison surrendered. The Americans found not just the Lipizzaner mares, but also Arabians, thoroughbreds, and captured Russian horses, more than 1,200 animals in total. Before the horses could be evacuated, the farm was attacked twice by Waffen-SS infantry, who had not been part of the surrender arrangement. Both attacks were repelled. In one of the genuinely surreal moments of the entire war, the composite force defending the horses included American GIs, surrendered Wehrmacht soldiers, freed Allied prisoners of war of multiple nationalities, and a group of anti-communist Cossack cavalry volunteers, all fighting together against the SS to save a herd of horses. Colonel Reed himself later reflected on what he was feeling during those final chaotic days of the war. "We were so tired of death and destruction. We wanted to do something beautiful." The horses were evacuated successfully, herded and trucked 35 miles to safety in Bavaria. The last of them crossed the border just as the first Soviet T-34 tank was observed entering Hostau from the other direction. The Lipizzaner mares eventually returned to Austria. The performing stallions, which had been evacuated to St. Martin's in Upper Austria, performed a special demonstration for General Patton on May 7, 1945, but just 1 day before Germany's final surrender. Patton, watching the horses move through their ancient classical exercises amid the ruins of a continent, wrote in his diary that it struck him as strange that in the midst of a world at war, men would spend their entire lives teaching horses to lift their feet in perfect rhythm. And then he added, almost reluctantly, "On the other hand, it is probably wrong to allow any highly developed art, no matter how foolish, to disappear from the earth. The descendants of those rescued horses still perform at the Spanish riding school in Vienna today. What the Soviets did. For the hundreds of thousands of horses that did not end up in one of the dramatic rescue stories, the reality in the Soviet-controlled zones of Germany and Eastern Europe was far more pragmatic and far harder. The Red Army had entered the war in 1941 with approximately 21 million horses in the Soviet Union overall, and had lost most of them in the catastrophic first years of the German advance. By 1943, the Soviet horse population had dropped from 21 million to 7.8 million, a loss of over 13 million animals in 2 years. The agricultural devastation this represented was staggering. Soviet collective farms that had depended on horsepower for every aspect of production were left with almost nothing to work with. When the Red Army advanced westward and then into Germany itself in 1945, the captured horses they found were not seen primarily as magnificent animals with centuries of breeding behind them, or as the companions of soldiers who had fought and died alongside them. They were agricultural tools, desperately needed ones. Tens of thousands of horses captured from the retreating Wehrmacht were immediately pressed into service pulling Soviet military supply wagons. The Red Army's logistics, despite being significantly more motorized than Germany's, still depended heavily on horse transport in the final months of the war, particularly in areas where the road network was destroyed or where fuel supplies were irregular. Once the fighting stopped, captured horses were redistributed to Soviet collective farms, many of which had been operating at near subsistence level for years. Some were taken further east, deep into the Soviet interior, to breeding programs that needed quality bloodstock to rebuild depleted herds. The Trakehner stallions that fell into Soviet hands, for instance, were taken to the Kirov stud and used to create the Russian Trakehner line, which still exists. Many horses, however, simply did not survive the transition from German military service to Soviet occupation. Animals that had been working at the outer edge of their physical endurance for years, who had survived artillery fire and Russian winters and starvation rations, died in the immediate aftermath of the war from the accumulated damage. Others died from diseases that swept through the large concentrations of animals being held in temporary facilities. Others were slaughtered for food by Soviet soldiers who saw the practical value of a horse carcass very clearly and had no particular reason not to act on it. The Soviet zone of Germany, which would eventually become East Germany, underwent significant agricultural reorganization under Soviet direction. Horses that had belonged to German farming families were subject to confiscation as part of land reform programs. Families that had kept horses for generations suddenly found them taken away to be redistributed to new collective enterprises. The transformation was rapid and often brutal, and many animals did not survive the administrative chaos of being transferred from private care to collective management with inadequate facilities and understaffed veterinary support. The Western zones, farmers, auctions, and euthanasia. In the American, British, and French zones of occupied Germany, the fate of horses followed a somewhat different but no less difficult path. The Allied veterinary teams that swept through Germany in the months following the surrender found an animal population in severe distress. Years of overwork, inadequate feed, exposure to cold and disease, and the physical trauma of artillery and aerial bombardment had left many horses in states of advanced physical deterioration, wounds that had never properly healed, bones damaged by falls on ice and rubble, respiratory damage from breathing the smoke of burning cities and forests, animals that had been built for generations to carry 250 pounds across 30 miles in a day and were now so depleted they could barely stand. Military veterinarians conducted systematic inspections of horses found in the occupation zones. Animals deemed serviceable were categorized and either sold to farmers, transferred to Allied military units that still had need of horses, or held in military-run collection facilities while their ultimate disposition was determined. Animals deemed too damaged for work were euthanized. Some were auctioned to whoever would take them: farmers, civilian institutions, French army units that maintained cavalry into the late 1940s. What is striking about this period is the genuine practical need that horse labor filled in immediate post-war Germany. The country's transportation infrastructure was in ruins. The Allies had specifically targeted Germany's rail system throughout the war, and by May 1945, the railway network that had been the circulatory system of the German economy was largely destroyed. Roads were cratered, bridges were down, vehicles were wrecked or confiscated. Fuel was scarce, rationed carefully for essential military and civilian purposes. Into this void, horsepower returned as a practical necessity. German farmers who had lost their tractors to wartime requisition, or whose tractors had been damaged or stolen, turned to horses to bring in whatever harvests remained. Municipalities used horses to move rubble from bombed streets, to deliver food to distribution points, to carry materials for the most urgent reconstruction. In Berlin and Hamburg and Frankfurt, cities that had been reduced in large parts to landscapes of broken stone, the sound of iron horseshoes on rubble became as common as it had been in the 19th century. There was something deeply strange about this reversal. Germany had entered the war with the world's most famous propaganda image of armored mechanized warfare, and it was ending the war with horses pulling plows through fields where tank wrecks rusted in the furrows. The Allied occupation authorities, for their part, were focused overwhelmingly on the human catastrophe they faced. Millions of displaced persons, returning prisoners of war, expellees from the East, bombed-out urban populations, all required food, shelter, medicine, and administrative attention at a scale that consumed virtually the entire capacity of the occupation apparatus. The question of what to do with horses was genuinely low on the priority list. This meant that many horses simply fell through the cracks. Animals that had no clear owner because their owner had died, surrendered, or been separated from them in the chaos of the final weeks, existed in a kind of administrative limbo. Whoever found them could claim them, use them, sell them, or slaughter them. Many were claimed by returning German soldiers who needed some form of income and found that owning a horse suddenly made them employable as farm laborers or transport workers. Others were taken by civilian refugees from the East who had arrived in the western zones with nothing and saw an unclaimed horse as the difference between survival and destitution. Some horses were simply turned loose into the countryside, their owners having decided they could not afford to feed them through the first terrible winter after the war. The hunger winters and what came after. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the coldest Germany had experienced in living memory. It came to be known as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. And it represented in some ways the true nadir of Germany's post-war suffering. The context matters enormously here. Germany's agricultural production had been severely disrupted by 6 years of war. Fields had been fought over, flooded by destroyed drainage systems, stripped of topsoil by artillery barrages. The labor force that had worked German farms, mostly men, had been killed or was still in prisoner of war camps. The machinery of modern agriculture was broken, confiscated, or simply absent. The American occupation authorities, operating under directives that were designed to prevent Germany from rebuilding its industrial and military power, initially restricted even humanitarian food aid. In the American and British occupation zones, civilians received approximately 1,200 calories per day in the first months of the occupation. The official target was 1,550 calories, already well below the roughly 2,000 calories per day, considered the minimum for healthy adult function. In the British zone, the actual ration was reduced to 1,000 calories per day in March 1946. In some cities during the worst of the hunger winter, people were surviving on approximately 700 calories a day. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, sent urgent warnings to Washington. There is no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. The impact on horses during this period was severe. Animals that might have been sustained in better times could not be fed when grain itself was desperately short. The farmers who had taken in horses after the war found themselves unable to keep them through a winter this hard. Some horses were sold at whatever price they would fetch. Some were traded on the black market. Some were simply slaughtered for meat. Because in a Germany where people were surviving on 700 calories a day, a horse carcass represented weeks of protein. The consumption of horse meat, which had been growing throughout the war out of necessity, continued and even accelerated in the immediate post-war years. This was not sentimental or ideological. It was hunger. The choice between feeding a horse you could not afford to keep and eating a horse you could no longer afford to keep was no choice at all. Those German cavalry units that had surrendered in good order in the West fared somewhat better, at least initially. The horse troops of the Wehrmacht who surrendered to British forces in Austria in the spring of 1945 were held briefly as prisoners of war and then released, with their horses returned to them to be handed over to local farmers. This represented one of the more orderly transitions of the entire post-war horse situation. But even these animals faced the same grinding poverty of the occupation years once they entered the farming economy. By 1948 and 1949, as the Marshall Plan began flowing genuine resources into the Western occupation zones and the German economy started its long recovery, the pressure on the surviving horse population began to ease. But the horses that had carried the Wehrmacht through 6 years of war had been reduced enormously in number, scattered across a continent, and absorbed into whatever uses a devastated society could find for them. The approximately 400,000 horses still alive on German soil in May 1945, itself a fraction of the millions that had served and died over the course of the war, dispersed in all directions. Some went east with the Soviets, some went north and west with the various Allied armies. Some stayed on German farms. Some were sold to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where agricultural labor was equally scarce. Some were auctioned at military disposal sales and ended up in Ireland or Britain, and a significant number, the most emaciated, the most damaged, the animals that had simply given everything they had, were euthanized by veterinary teams who could find no better solution. A reckoning without a memorial. When you try to put a number to the total cost of the Second World War in horse lives, the figures are genuinely difficult to nail down, which is itself telling. The war effort kept meticulous records of almost everything: ammunition expenditure, aircraft losses, casualty rates by battalion and division. But horses, despite being essential to the functioning of the German military, were not tracked with the same precision as weapon systems. The most reliable estimates suggest that somewhere between 1.75 million and 3.5 million horses died in the Second World War overall. Killed in combat, starved to death, worked to death, slaughtered for food, or simply lost in the chaos of a continent at war. When you factor in all the nations that employed horses, Germany, the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Italy, Japan, China, the true number may be higher than any single estimate captures. Germany alone lost at least 700,000 horses killed in service. The Soviet Union, which entered the war with 21 million horses and ended it with 7.8 million, a decline driven by both the war itself and the brutal requisitioning that accompanied it, lost an almost incomprehensible number. Of those 2.75 million horses that Germany put into military service over the course of the war, approximately 2/3 were killed or wounded. 2/3, and yet there are almost no memorials to them. Military cemeteries across Europe and the former Soviet Union hold hundreds of thousands of graves. The names of soldiers are carved in stone and bronze across dozens of countries. Museums preserve the tanks, the aircraft, the small arms, the uniforms of the men who fought. The history of the Second World War is told through human eyes, human decisions, human suffering. As it largely should be, but the horses who pulled the artillery that killed tens of thousands of people, who hauled the supplies that kept armies in the field, who carried the messages that shaped the course of battles, They rest in no particular place. There is no marker for the 179,000 horses who died in the Russian winter of 1941 to 1942. There is no memorial for the animals who went through the ice of the Frisches Hof, or who froze standing up on the roads of East Prussia, or who were worked until their hearts stopped on the roads of the Soviet steppe. Germany, in its post-war culture, engaged in a profound and painful process of reckoning with its history, acknowledging the crimes of the Nazi regime, memorializing the victims of the Holocaust, building institutions dedicated to the prevention of future atrocities. This was necessary and important work, but in that process, the animals who made the war mechanically possible, who literally moved the guns, the food, the ammunition, and the men, received essentially no acknowledgement at all. This silence is not unique to Germany. The United Kingdom built memorials to its horses of the First World War, including the Animals in War Memorial in London, unveiled in 2004. The Second World War horse has no comparable monument anywhere in Europe. The story of the German war horse does not appear in any of the major German war museums, in the way that tank production statistics or Air Force losses do. History, it turns out, remembers machines better than it remembers living things. What we can take from this? There is a pattern in this story that goes beyond horses, beyond Germany, beyond the Second World War. It is the pattern of utility and forgetting, of creatures and people and things that are essential to a particular moment, exploited to the limit of their endurance, and then quietly discarded when the moment passes. The horses of the Wehrmacht were bred, trained, purchased, requisitioned, and driven across some of the most terrible landscapes of the 20th century, because the German military needed them and had no viable alternative. They performed this function without complaint, because complaint was not available to them as an option. They froze in Russian winters, starved on the Eastern Front, drowned in Baltic lagoons, and died by the thousands on roads that led from one catastrophe to the next. And when the war ended, the world moved on without them. The survivors were absorbed into the general poverty and dislocation of post-war Europe. Some found good homes, many did not. A few remarkable stories, the Lipizzaner rescue, the Trakehner Trek, the cavalry surrenders in Austria, survived in historical memory because they were dramatic enough, or involved famous people, or touched on breeds famous enough to be worth preserving. But for most of those 400,000 horses in Germany in May 1945, the end of the war simply meant the beginning of a different kind of hard existence. Peace was, for many of them, not a salvation, but a change of circumstances. The shelling stopped, the retreats stopped, but the hunger continued, the exhaustion continued, the cold continued. They had not chosen the war. They had no say in any of it, not in the political decisions that led to it, not in the military decisions that placed them on those frozen roads, not in the economic calculations that treated their lives as expendable inputs in a massive industrial effort. They were drafted without consent, deployed without explanation, and discharged without ceremony. What remains of them today is mostly hidden in plain sight, in the bloodlines of warm-blood sport horses competing in Olympic arenas, in the careful entries of breeders' registries that record mares whose papers were lost due to events of war, in the quiet grazing of Lipizzaner descendants in the pastures of Piber, Austria. The physical trace of those 2.75 million animals that served the German military is almost completely gone. The Trakehner stud farm at Trakehner no longer exists. The town itself was renamed Yasnaya Polyana by Soviet administrators and Russified out of recognition. The roads they died on are paved over. The fields they worked are farmed by different people in different countries. But the story matters. It matters because any honest accounting of what the Second World War was and how it was fought has to include the full cost, not just the human cost, which was catastrophic and deserves every ounce of the attention it receives, but the cost measured in every kind of life that was consumed by it. 8 million horses died in the First World War. Between 1.75 million and 3.5 million died in the Second. That is somewhere between 10 and 11 million horses killed in the two great wars of the 20th century. 11 million animals who woke up every morning in the service of human conflicts they could not begin to understand, and who went on pulling the guns and wagons and supply carts until they could not pull any more. They deserve to be remembered. Not in the way we remember generals or battles or political turning points, but in the way we remember any living thing that was caught up in something larger than itself and paid the full price of it without ever understanding why. If you found this story worth watching, please consider subscribing to the channel. We cover the lesser-known corners of the Second World War, the stories that don't always make it into the major documentaries or the famous films, but that are essential to understanding what the war actually was and how it was actually fought. Every like and every subscription helps us keep making these videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.